Alright everyone, unfortunately the Ebola epidemic in the Congo is by far not over. In fact, it's beginning to spread more quickly now. You've gone from, what was it, 600 confirmed cases, I think now it's 800 and 600 deaths or some total like that. It's begun to increase at a faster rate in addition to the rate it was already increasing at. You've got more cases and you've got more new cases, in other words, and it's already hit Butembo. You've had a handful of cases there, and because of the incubation period being 3 weeks, unfortunately that means you're going to get another wave potentially of cases. If they left even one person unquarantined that had it, came into contact with it, I think that would be a problem. Ebola is now spreading towards more major metropolitan regions. That's what they're worried about. There's a city called, I believe, Goma, if I remember correctly, where it's headed towards. Unfortunately, that means it's approaching a much larger metropolitan area, like bigger than Butembo by several times, which also is a major hub of regional movement, travel to and from Rwanda and places like that. If it gets there, it's the worst case scenario, because then you'll, instead of having like a few dozen new cases today, you'll have a few hundred new cases today, and it'll begin to look like the West Africa epidemic. The problem is, again, like that epidemic got out of hand in part because of burial practices and people's superstitions with regards to the medical workers. Here you don't have that quite as much. What you do have, though, is a civil war and a constant malaria problems now. You've got instances where Ebola wards have been actually attacked, aid workers have been attacked. Again, malaria has broken out now because there's, it's kind of hard to ship anti-malarial drugs and mosquito nets through a war zone. And cholera, I'm assuming, would eventually become a problem if order begins to break down. You've had the elections in parts of Congo, North Kivu, I believe, delayed, which led to a great deal of ire. You could have potentially a bigger civil war there. You could have a uprising, a rebellion of some of these towns full of people who want to participate in a rather fragile political process in a place like maybe the Congo or Rwanda. It could become a huge problem. It could also lock down all trade and travel within this region. Unfortunately, the world's still not taking it seriously. The biggest risk is not a few Ebola cases. The biggest risk is it mutates, which we've seen. It readily mutates. It did in the West Africa epidemic. That's why it spread faster. It became slightly more infectious. Normally, Ebola is actually relatively difficult to contract. Unfortunately, it became much easier at getting its way into people's bodies while retaining a fairly high death rate, and the death rate's about 50-50. You catch it, you got a 50-50 chance of dying under good circumstances. Is a good circumstance you're in a field hospital that could get attacked anytime with a shortage of every bit of equipment and aid you could possibly get, with a dirt floor and like no dehumidifier, so you're sweltering anyway in the jungle heat? Yeah, that's probably not the greatest place to have Ebola. Not that it's great to have it even in a top-level Western hospital, as unfortunately people have found out. It could spread further. It could really become a problem. It could break all containment and be uncontained for a great deal of time and become endemic. It could become something that just sort of burns through the population. It could be still going on a year from now. What if there's a separate outbreak somewhere else in the Congo? All hell's going to break loose. It doesn't even have to be the result of the same strain. You'd have 2-3 strains going at a time. There was a miniature outbreak in the Congo, you'll remember. I think that was in the center of the Congo. During the West Africa outbreak, and people were terrified. They thought it was the same thing spreading halfway across the continent. Thankfully, that turned out not to be the case. My biggest fear, though, is that people look the other way. They say, well, it's in the middle of Africa, nobody cares. World trade and travel is a thing. And now it's headed towards a city that does have, at least regionally, a fairly large impact on travel. So it gets further. It's one step away from Lagos. It's one step away from Pretoria. It's one step away from Cairo or something. Can you imagine Cairo? How many millions of people are packed into Cairo? Isn't it like 8 million people or some crazy number living in there, and several million just within the core of Cairo, where things are packed in, balls to the wall constantly, and there's a hell of a lot of travel to and from Europe? Yes, wonderful. That would be so great. People were all panicked over that one possible case in Sweden, which I correctly identified probably wasn't Ebola, and it wasn't. It was some other, fucking virus. They traveled to Africa and then they vomited, so they thought they had Ebola, I guess. This is how easily spooked people are. Meanwhile, they're not worried about the fact that now hundreds of people have died of a very real Ebola epidemic, and that it's hit at least a couple of local metropolitan centers of commerce, namely Butembo and that one city directly north of it. I can't remember the name of of it for the life of me. I think it was a fairly complicated name. It's going to be difficult to pronounce some things, if I'm being honest. Nobody cares that Ebola is killing hundreds of people. They think it's out of sight, out of mind. I think it's just like pollution. It's just like looking at it, well, you know, India has rivers that light on fire and China's got all this smog. But over here, there's no smog today here, so everything's fine. No, it's still being generated and it's still a problem. You know, this world is kind of interconnected at this point. I think we need to start realizing that. Shouldn't be in a political or military capacity. Certainly globalism in the general economic sense is evil and depraved in every possible way. But working together to try to suppress disease outbreaks makes sense. Have you ever heard of quarantine? And there are some people, oh, quarantine doesn't work. It's meaningless. No, I think. Remember when the Black Plague broke out in some western province of China a couple of years ago? People thought that was going to be a big problem too. They had the plague. I think like 1,000 people died. They literally surrounded the whole area with tanks and were ready to kill anything that moved. Essentially, well, maybe a little bit brutal, which is everything within the Chinese government's sort of forays into its own population. But it worked. It did suppress the plague. Maybe we should start thinking about a military option in cases where you already have a civil war going on anyway. But people, they don't care. They don't care until it hits their own countries or a major Western metropolitan district like New York City or something like London. Until then, it'll be yawn and go back to sleep. Again, out of sight, out of mind. I think that's crazy. I think that's very short-sighted, actually, and quite frightening that people would think that way. That's about all. Peace out.